Business Diplomacy Today, the podcast about international relations and geopolitics from a business perspective. We help you anticipate the changing political and societal trends that influence your business.
Welcome. My name is Matthias Catón. I'm your host. Business Diplomacy Today is sponsored by the Indo-German Center for Business Excellence. The center is a think tank, research center, and network that connects people and organizations interested in business relations between India and Germany. As an academic institution founded in 2021 at Frankfurt School of Finance and Management, it is independent and impartial, but always close to the real world. To find out more about the center, please go to indogerman.center, and you can also find this link in the show notes. Our topic today is global risks, and specifically the Global Risk Report, an annual report published by the World Economic Forum, Marsh McLennan, and Zurich. And I'm excited to welcome Martin Drux today, who is with Marsh McLennan. He is the multinational client service leader for Europe, and he's based in Düsseldorf, Germany. Martin brings a wealth of experience from his 30-year tenure in the insurance industry, where he has continually engaged with large multinational clients. His career has taken him from Germany to stints in the US, Asia, and the UK, and since joining Marsh in 2007, Martin has significantly influenced their approach on serving German companies, and he has also led Marsh's multinational practice in Europe since 2013. He is both fluent in German and English, but we'll speak English today, of course, as is customary on this podcast. And he has agreed to share a little bit some of the insights that came out of the latest Global Risks Report. Martin, welcome to this podcast.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Some of our listeners will probably have heard about the Global Risk Report. I think it's currently in its 19th edition, if I'm not mistaken. So it's not a new product. It has a well-established track record. But maybe tell the listeners who are not so familiar with it, what is it? What's the purpose? What can I find in there? Just a general overview to kick things off.
So the Global Risk Report is indeed in its 19th edition, and it usually comes out around the World Economic Forum in Davos around January. And what it does is it's over the last quarter, the year before, we're asking professionals, business leaders, risk managers, insurance managers about their outlook around their assessment of risk and how they see the immediate and long distance future. And out of that accumulated knowledge, we can then form a real story about what's relevant, what to expect, and how can you as a business prepare for the future and build the resilience that's needed to survive in the long distance. Now,
it seems that we live in a risky world, so to speak. There's a lot of things are going on, happening. There's a lot of uncertainty. What are the major risks that came out of this year's report?
First, a warning, this is not the most enjoyable or funny read that you can imagine. And then we're looking at a short and long-term perspective. So the risk that really stuck out as a new one is misinformation, disinformation. So this comes in the context of, one is the rise, the rapid rise of artificial intelligence on one hand side, but then also a year of unparalleled elections. So we have, don't know the exact number, but it's like an incredible percentage of human population asked to vote this year. We already had elections in Turkey, in Russia, we have India, we have the USA coming up, some regional elections. And so in that time, there's a concern that through the use of artificial intelligence and other populist agendas, there will be a lot of misinformation leading to a undermining of democracies as we used to know them. So that is right now, that I would say, a new and one of the more short-term worries. If you look in the longer distance, it's going to change dramatically. But that is something that you need to understand in this. When reading this report, there's always this short-term view, which is predominantly influenced by ongoing news, like watching the news every day, reading the news. And then there is this long-term perspective, which is really more the strategic one. What is going on regardless of, let's say, temporary turbulences?
And what would those be? I assume climate change is something that is an ongoing concern?
Absolutely. If you look at, so we have different color codes. If you read the report, you see technical risk, you see social risk, and you see economic or financial risk. And they have different colors. And the short term is very colorful. You have all colors represented. If you look in the long distance, the top 5 risks are all green. And that is, extreme weather events, natural resources, scarcity, and we have loss of biodiversity, all these kind of things. It's really pollution. These are the risks that are really seen as the core risk for the survival of the human race, if you want to say it in a dramatic way. Whereas the short term, yes, we have extreme weather events. We have known and seen that for a while. But right now, we are more worried about wars and interstate conflict. We have social unrest, we have democracies at risk, and then of course the link to a lot of this migration. And those are the short-term risks, which then in the long term don't seem to be as relevant and as existential. Let's say the accumulated assessment of all these surveys that we did.
You've been with Marsh McLennan for quite some time now, 17 years, if I did the math correctly, or almost 17 years. But as I said, you have basically 3 decades of experience in the insurance sector. And insurances are very closely related to risk. One could even say that that's the essence of an insurer, is to manage risk or be able to work with clients to offset some risks. Now, if you look back over the 3 decades that you've been working in the sector, how have risks evolved over that time? I assume that 30 years ago, climate change was a topic where it seemed probably remote, at least when it comes to your business, or was that already something that you've been discussing?
Well, first of all, I actually feel really old, but I would say that the insurance industry is a very, very conservative, slow-moving industry, because it's by nature, we are very risk-adverse people. We're not permanently coming up with new innovations and let's try this, let's try that. So I would say the first 10, 15, maybe even 20 years of my career were very, very stable in terms of the core risk were classical insurance lines. So we are looking after, industrial insurance and not personal insurance. So property risk, property damage, business interruption. So fire, earthquake, what have you. Then general and products liability. And starting in the 90s, also directors and officers liability. But there haven't been many new innovations, new products, and the this fear of existential risk in terms of extreme climate change and extreme weather events, that really started getting some momentum in the last 10 years. And I would say with that came also some other risks. Cyber has become a big issue. Cyber risk didn't exist back in. Yes, there were computers, but there wasn't the fear that, let's say, some hackers could switch off an entire power grid or, access the data of big financial institutions and spread it or, hold a company for ransom. This is something that really, so I would say in terms of the risk environment, it has changed from a very, very smooth train ride to a very bumpy flight over the last couple of years. So it's not just one risk that came up, it's a whole range of risks that impact our businesses and also the way we look at risk.
Now, as I said, for insurers, it has always been crucial since they exist to look at risk and somehow try to calculate that, because otherwise, if they make 2 big mistakes, I guess it's very easy to get out of business in one way or another. But if you look at other companies, non-insuring companies, do you think they're sufficiently good at assessing risks, or is that something that is still to be desired?
Of course, we're working very closely with the risk managers, because most of our partners are the insurance risk managers, and then there's, of course, the broader enterprise risk management team. I would say the large corporations that you would follow, the DAX 40 in Germany and others, they are very, very sophisticated in terms of risk. So it's not like they're just waking up to, this is a landscape. And their view is not starting with insurance. Their view is with a broader risk, because some main risks are not really insurable. Just think about, just one thing that comes to my mind is if you're selling food products and you have a recall, yes, you can insure the recall, but the reputational damage is not insurable. But if so I'm still thinking of some products that have been off the shelf 20 years ago because of one recall that I remember. So that's not insurable, but companies need to take those into consideration. And so, yes, I would say that at the top level, we're dealing with very sophisticated risk managers and risk management departments. As you go, I would say further down size, age, complexity of the companies, then it might be a little bit more reactive. But the big names where you can buy stock from, I mean, you can rest assured that they have very, very good understanding of their risk.
But is that also forward-looking? Because I sometimes wonder whether we're not too much swayed by things that are recently on the agenda. So it's a well-known psychological bias, recency or saliency issue. Most people, I guess, were somehow surprised by the COVID pandemic when it started. Then suddenly everybody talked about pandemics and, preparedness for pandemics. Now you mentioned disinformation being very high on the agenda, which to a certain extent doesn't seem to be surprising. Everybody's talking about AI now for the past 12 months or so. We've seen some of these deep fakes and all these kind of things. So are we really looking towards the next risks that are coming up, or are we merely reflecting also maybe to a certain extent in some of these reports what is going on right now and trying to regurgitate what is being discussed or what is being experienced right now?
I would say both, because on one hand, it's very true. There is a nice table in the risk report where it looks, so the report is 19 years old, but for the last 12 years, we've been putting the top risk into a table to compare them. And if you go through it, you see risk popping up. And if you then take maybe a trip down memory lane and you look at what happened that year, you can link it to something that was in the news that year or the year before. So you're absolutely right. There is a bit of a reactive aspect. I think that's part of the human brain, the human race. I mean, let's say a couple of years ago, we had a couple of terrorist attacks, and then terrorist attacks was in everybody's mind. Now, that for the time being has come down. I mean, that doesn't say that the risk isn't there. It's still there. It's probably more there than ever, but there hasn't been anything in the news. So then the pandemic came, and then everybody was thinking about, pandemics being the most important. This is gone completely. I think it's dropped down to 38. If you read in the report, though, due to the melting of the permafrost, there is a risk that ancient viruses and diseases will come back to life and come to haunt us. Oh, by the way, I said it's not the most pleasant read, but that is right now not in the news. That is something that scientists predict for the years to come if, as I said, the permafrost is kind of like disappearing. So that is true. But then there is also, it would not be right to say that risk managers are just basically reacting to what's going on right now. So if I have conversations with clients, ESG, environmental, social, and governance is a real important issue for companies also to secure credits and get insurance and so on. And if you look at the way that companies are preparing for the future, and for future risks, it's quite impressive. So I'm working with companies that are motor or airplane manufacturers or that work in the cement industry. So all companies where you wouldn't think that, they are, for instance, very sustainable or very ESG friendly. No, but they're working very, very hard on changing their business model, their products to be very conform with the expectation. And it's the same way they look at the long-term, because that's a business risk I'm talking about. But then they're also looking at long-term risk. But again, it's a mix of both. But I can say that, yes, there is the short-term reaction, but there is also a long-term planning in the clients that we work with.
Can you give some examples, maybe, what companies do? You don't have to name any specific company, but to give our listeners a bit of a more concrete idea, how would such a company approach this risk management process?
Coming from the business risk, good examples, of course, changing from fossil energy to hydro energy. Those kind of things is one example where it's clear that there is a finite resource for fossil energy, but then also it's getting more and more penalized by the finance sector, by insurance and so on. That's one particular risk. But also you need to look into, for instance, in terms of manufacturing. If you think about, it was very easy to move production sites anywhere around the world. Because just move it wherever it's the cheapest. But now with the problems in the Red Sea, first we had the Evergreen, or I think it was the Evergreen ship that blocked it for a while. Or now you have Houthi rebels attacking boats and they have to get around. People are thinking about probably producing closer to where the customers are. So those are a lot of things where where this is real risk management in action.
Is it possible to prepare for every risk? You mentioned these ancient viruses that may come out of permafrost. That sounds like a scary Hollywood movie. Some things are more likely to happen and others less so. Is it possible for a company, but even maybe for society at large, to prepare for every possible contingency? Or are the costs for such preparation not in the end maybe higher than, just wait and see what happens and trying to handle the outfall when something goes wrong?
I think risk is part of our life. So we will not be able to prepare for all these things to happen. Secondly, it is maybe about the global risk report, an important reminder is to say that this is a survey. One is called a risk perception survey, and the other one is, I think, a business opinion. So perception and opinion, of course, and it's clear that this is not fortune teller that came down from, a mountain and said, like, this is what the future is going to look like. They say that these are risks that could come and some of these risks will come. But for instance, if you look at climate change, yes, we know that there is a big risk and there is it will worsen, but we do not know exactly what's going to happen. Or if you remember the pandemic here in Germany, it felt like 5-6, virologists that overnight became celebrities, and they all said something completely different. They're all very, very experienced subject matter experts, and yet they could not agree on the assessment. What is it right now? Shall we stay at home? Shall we wear masks? So that's always important to take into consideration. Also, when you think about reading the report, that this is not the future written in stone. This is more a risk warning. It's kind of like you go to your doctor and the doctor says, well, you should stop smoking because you might get lung cancer. You should stop drinking. Keith Richards, he's a smoking, drinking 80-year-old rock star. He's still alive. So that risk didn't come true in his case. But based on statistics, there is a good chance that it's going to happen. And then you take meaningful measures to be prepared. The permafrost virus, nobody knows what and when it's going to come. We just probably the way we respond to that is then we take lessons from what we learned from the corona pandemic in terms of business resilience. For instance, when we, from day one, could move to our home offices and had a very good support from our company in that respect. So there was no business interruption. So I think you do it in a pragmatic and reasonable way.
Yeah, it's predictive, not deterministic, those models. But it's also well known that humans are very, very bad notoriously at judging probabilities in the correct way. So maybe that is also the reason why we often make mistakes. We mentioned technology earlier in our conversation as a risk, cybersecurity and all those things. Does technology also help us analyze and assess future risks? There's one example, I think it's quite old actually already, but Google at some point was able to determine flu outbreaks, I think, or at least they tried to work on a model basically by looking at what symptoms people were Googling for in what areas of the world. So is technology also something that is helpful in that respect?
Oh, absolutely, yes. And I think that with every risk that we show, there is also a great opportunity. For instance, the climate change, of course, triggers now more environmental friendly products. But for instance, the artificial intelligence, we see a great future in our own industry in terms of modeling risk, flood, earthquakes, other things. We can really use this and artificial intelligence is learning and advancing much, much quicker as we could do as humans. So we are already implementing artificial intelligence in our own offerings, in our own solutions and explore how we can predict certain scenarios, which of course then would also have a positive outcome on the insurance, because you would then have a completely different data set that you can present to insurers on which they can then underwrite a certain product or solution. Because traditionally in the insurance, there is this element of uncertainty. And the bigger the uncertainty linked to a large risk, the higher the premium. So insurers say like, yeah, if I want to take on this risk, I need to have more money because I'm not feeling comfortable. But artificial intelligence and the technology that comes with this, of course, brings a completely different quality of data and predictability.
I would now like to come to our segment.
Executive Briefing, what you should read now.
So I would like to invite you to give some reading or other recommendations for people who would like to dive in a bit deeper into this topic of risk.
First of all, I have to recommend the Global Risk Report because that's a real good book. Books that I'm reading more are linked more to the human resources factor, to people and cultural things. So having to deal with risk in everyday environment, I'm not really going home and then read books about risk. One book that I really enjoy, it's a permanent presence because I'm in a multinational, is a book called Kiss, Bow or Shake Hands by Terry Morrison. And that is a book about really business culture around the world. The book analyzes 60 countries around the world and how people think in terms of business, hierarchy, but also risk and other things. And that to me is always a good read because in multinational I need to deal with countries and cultures around the world and always make sure that I'm not missing the right tone and do something that would be normal in my culture but not in others. That is really one book that I really like, and I have in the last couple of years very much branched into this element of the human factor. So one of the areas, of course, that is in the risk report is the war for talent. In some regions, you see a risk as unemployment, but in Europe, it's more the other way around. It's risk for talent. So we are getting old, and we need talent, and so that's really the one part, if you want to call that a risk, where I'm really reading a lot.
Thank you very much. And as usual, we will put links to those titles in the show notes so that our listeners can find and access them there. I would now like to look a little bit at geopolitical risks. And obviously, we've seen the war in Ukraine going on for quite some time now. We now have, for a couple of months, we've had increased tensions in the Middle East following the terrorist attacks on Israel in October 2023. We still have the issue of China, an increasingly assertive China in its neighborhood in the South China Sea, potentially with Taiwan. So where do you see geopolitical risks going forward in 2024 and beyond?
Well, that's, of course, a very interesting, but also a very difficult question to answer, because what is clear is that the setup that we grew up in, basically East versus West, two big blocks with nuclear weapons, and that kind of stabilized the world. What we see now is really an overall shift of power. We see some kind of new blocks forming with China very much in the center, but then also China having close ties to North Korea, to Iran, to Russia. So that is playing out, and I'm not sure because to what level this escalation will go. And what I do expect is that there will be uncertainty or instability for some time to come until it gets back into kind of like a new setup where, nations can coexist with each other. What's worrying, of course, in today's world is that, we always had this kind of stuff in the past, right? We had 2 world wars, we had all kinds of regional conflicts, but those were, dealt with in a conventional way, as are the current conflicts. But of course, we have a escalation potential with the kind of, weapons that we have at hand. And so that is a bit of the worrying factor. On the other hand, honestly, that's my personal opinion. I'm not sure to what extent this is a bit of a show, whereas the real wars that are going on is really the distribution of resources, of money and wealth in the background. So my hope is, of course, that, this is ultimately the real political front where we make sure that there is a trading balance in the world where people then kind of settle down, because I think a lot of this is smokes and guns, and the wars are not really the true conflict that is going on behind the scenes, because I think the expansion of China is all about access to resources, having the dominant role in the Pacific Ocean and in South China Sea. Very difficult for somebody like you and me who just read the news and then with all the misinformation, disinformation, to really look through what's going on behind the scenes. And again, I'm always an optimistic person, so I'm thinking that, and also the 30 years in risk and insurance taught me that, if I go back to the beginning, there has always been the end of the world looming. Even when I was a child, the forests were dying, the rivers were polluted, there was Chernobyl, there was the East versus West, potential nuclear conflict. And it continued. And I think the human race ultimately wants to survive. And therefore, I'm very positive that with all of the problems ahead of us, it also pushes us to be creative and find peaceful solutions. Maybe it's me, being an eternal optimist, but I think if you look back in history, it's a pattern that you can see.
Yeah, we all hope that you are right with your positive assessment, that's for sure. From a company perspective, given those risks and this a bit unclear and dynamic pattern, is there any way you recommend companies to prepare for those geopolitical issues? Or is that too complex and too dynamic and ultimately outside the influence of a company so that they just pretend that those things don't exist?
Oh no, it has to be part of the very core of the business strategy. I mean, I mentioned earlier the relocation of production sites. So, I mean, first of all, it's no longer, I would say, really ESG friendly. If you have, when you hear all these stories about having shrimps from the North Sea being flown to Morocco for peeling, to have them wrapped and then flown back to be sold because it's cheaper to have that peeling process done with all the shipments. So that is one part. But the other part is, of course, if you are producing in an area where it could be a conflict on the way, the shipment, think about the Red Sea, or where you have problems, let's say in China, like our chancellor was there the other day, and I think we're talking about, loss of intellectual property, those kind of things. So these things have to be built into consideration to move production into maybe more secure areas, to have a plan B. Some things you cannot predict because, there's also, you want to make business in China. You want to make business in certain countries. So you have to continue doing that, but you have to make sure that you don't put all of your eggs in one basket. So yes, by all means, we need or the companies need to spread out and go into markets, but have a diversified business plan that if one market breaks down, that it doesn't really affect, the entire business. And we just have to look back into Russia where, of course, 2 years ago, it was a big market. And then overnight, it was basically a sanctioned market. And a lot of companies had to say, okay, do we want to continue doing business there? Is it bad to our reputation? Is it, are we too dependent? And so on. And so from that perspective, it's I think there were lots of lessons learned. And I would say that it becomes more and more the core of what business planning and risk management is all about.
Are companies doing that sufficiently? Because a lot of people say that we're not really learning from past mistakes. You mentioned China, you mentioned Russia, you mentioned the German Chancellor visiting China a few days ago as we record this. And a lot of people would say, well, Germany is particular, but maybe the West in general is still too dependent on China, on Chinese economy. And we're repeating essentially the same mistake we made with Russia, just on a much larger scale, ultimately, because with Russia, it was essentially about gas or primary resources, whereas with China, of course, the level of integration is much, much deeper. Are we learning or not really?
I would say there is a learning going on, but there's also the necessity to continue doing business. I mean, I think sometimes we look at it from probably a very ethical point of view, that we say those countries do not have a democracy as we call it, or as we would expect it, or they have this certain regional aggression and so on and so forth. But at the same time, in order to survive, we need to have partnerships. We need to work together. I think it would be also very dangerous to cut ties and not to work together. And I think the more interests we have that unite us, the better it is also to find peaceful solutions. Basically, you're walking on thin ice all the time because you on one hand side, yes, you have your political and ethical views, you have certain allegiances with other countries that might come into conflict, but at the same time, it's important that we build and continue that relationship. But again, I would say diversification is important. I think the lesson we learned from Russia is, I think that, the gas from Russia was so cheap, so let's make that our number one source of gas. The good thing is, even there, we showed very quickly how to source it from other countries. It also showed the problems that, but also most, except for Norway, the other countries that we're getting it from also do not meet our standards of maybe human rights and democracy and what have you. if you're in politics, you have to make some compromises. That otherwise, nothing moves on. And also there's always a hope for a turn for the better in those countries. So yeah, I don't want to be the decision maker around all this, but I would not say that we are completely naively just ignore what has happened in the past and now we repeat all of our mistakes.
Let us now get to the other fixed segment in our podcast.
A bold prediction, the world in 10 years.
I would like to invite you to give us your best assessment, your prediction of how the world will look like in 10 years from now when it comes to those issues that we've been discussing here today.
Right, if only I could tell that. I mean, looking at the report, which is obviously not my opinion, but an accumulation of different perceptions, it says that the next 2 years will be bad, the next 10 years will be really bad. But that's based on just thinking about what's going on right now. So I would say that realistically, number one, we will still be alive in 10 years. That's number one prediction. And I said there is a fight going on between really innovating for improvement. So we see a lot of great innovation, and science is think about how quickly we could defend ourselves against coronavirus. Think about how fast AI is moving forward, how we are changing to a greener transportation, greener products, and so on. So there is this move to push for a better world. But I think in the short term, we will have very bumpy flight, lots of turbulences. So how long will it take for this to stabilize again? I don't know. I think it depends on various factors. So I would say it'll be rough 10 years, but it will be always like one step forward, one step back. It's like, we will have pushback like conflicts and riots and maybe also democracies disappearing and so on. But at the same time, we also see a move towards more human rights and maybe also more environmental friendly technologies, a use of AI for the greater good. So that's what I hope. And the other thing would be, I think I said in one of my presentations on the Global Risk Report, you just have to watch movies from the 1980s like Terminator, where they were predicting a future where basically artificial intelligence takes over. That would be the negative side of it, but I never saw these kind of scenarios come true because I think the human race has a number one goal, and that is our own survival.
Thank you very much. You are obviously positive in the long run, as you said, slightly more pessimistic when it comes to the next 10 years. But obviously what counts is the long run ultimately. Martin, thank you very much. We've come to the end of this episode. Thank you very much for giving us an insight into the Global Risk Report 2024 and also on global risks more generally. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much for having me.
This was another episode of the Business Diplomacy Today podcast. This podcast is presented by the Indo-German Center for Business Excellence. If you like the show, make sure to subscribe to it on your favorite podcasting platform. And of course, we would also be delighted if you would leave a review or a rating there. You can also go to our website at businessdiplomacy.today to check out the show notes of this episode. And that's it for today. Thanks for listening.